Chapter 8. We can create favorable circumstances. There's always a way out. The most important thing to understand about the center of gravity, or your position, is that it's relative and constantly changing. Your strengths and weaknesses ebb and flow depending on the day and time and what other people are doing. Sometimes the situation works for you, and sometimes you'll struggle. You can feel confused, annoyed, and think though you're wasting your time. But in those moments, remember that much as the situation has started to work against you, you can also find a way to change it. No situation, no matter how desperate, is completely beyond salvation. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is completely positive or negative. Even when it might feel like everything and everyone is against you, know that there's always a way to turn things around. You just have to find out how. There's always opportunity, and there always is hope. Change the rules of the game to suit your resources. Change how people think of you. Change the number of people supporting you. And because you know that there's always opportunity, you don't have to try and force things. You may have heard the phrase, "Don't go searching for your keys under a streetlight." People tend to search for something where it's the easiest to look, but that's neither helpful nor useful. We try things that have worked in the past, hoping that they'll work again. We complain to our spouses rather than our bosses because it's safer, all the while knowing that it'll unlikely lead to any change. Or maybe we refuse to change the way we behave because we stubbornly convince ourselves that our authenticity is our most valued character trait. Acknowledging that there are limits to our knowledge, capabilities, power, and influence is sometimes a hard pill to swallow. In these times, if we're willing to pivot to an approach that better matches what we're seeing, we might just find a way out. Sometimes we have to grit our teeth and follow the road down a path we don't want to go down. The alternative, continuing to try and push through in a way that hasn't been working, isn't wisdom. There's usually little to be gained by going head-to-head with someone or something, especially when they're at their strongest. Now you're probably thinking, but I can't be doing nothing. I can't be avoiding others or running away all the time. And I would agree with you. You're absolutely right. We don't have to wait for the situation to change. We can take matters into our own hands and try to change the situation ourselves. We can create circumstances that favor us. Sun Tzu called this creating favorable circumstances, working on changing the situation so that there are more forces, think elements like people, the political environment, and technology that support you and the actions you want to take. When the Chinese government first entered the world stage, they wanted to gain support for their international policies. So what did they do? They focused on spreading the beauty of the Chinese people and culture at large. This gave them a source of international goodwill and made the international community more accepting of their perspectives. Later, when the Chinese government came out with more controversial stances, the international community were unconsciously more willing to see things from their point of view. Creating forces that support you will increase the chance of your success and will make pushing through your actions more efficient and successful. We're not sitting idly by waiting until the circumstances are right. We're making moves to create the right opportunities. We're taking measures to alter our circumstances and then acting when we have the highest chance for success. If you wanted to attack the east side of a city, you wouldn't focus all your energy on the east. You would find ways to keep the opposing army occupied in the west. You would make sure that your supply and communication lines were established, and you would recruit more soldiers to ensure that you had enough reserve troops ready to fill the gaps left by dead soldiers. History is full of examples of truly creative ways that people have used circumstances to their advantage. And many of these people were living more than 2,000 years ago, people who were less educated and knowledgeable than you. Be patient and open your mind to seeing the opportunities. The clothing in Qi. During the spring and autumn period, many citizens from the state of Qi lived a life of laziness and glut, as they were extremely wealthy after a series of successful military conquests. With not much to do, most citizens spent their days trying to find new ways to have a good time. The state's chancellor despised them because they weren't being productive contributors to society, and he feared that more and more people would learn from their behavior and bad habits. He said, "I hate these people so much, I would be in my right mind to have them all arrested and buried alive." His peer, Guanzhong, luckily, had a more subdued attitude. "Don't worry, let me deal with this issue. If what I try doesn't work, then maybe we'll try your way a little later." Guanzhong's first move was to establish a new law about clothing. Under the new law, each person was required to wear a different type of uniform depending on their profession. Businessmen and construction workers alike had to wear uniforms, a different color for each profession. But if you didn't have to work, you were lucky enough to wear the most beautiful uniform of them all, a beautiful white uniform. After 1 year of this regime, the wealthy people without jobs were growing tired of how they were being treated. They were constantly ridiculed and being judged because people could immediately tell that they were wealthy. They could spot them very clearly from great distances because of their reflective white uniforms. People were jealous of their wealth and treated them poorly. The wealthy eventually started to find ways to be productive on their own. Just as Guanzhong had predicted, Guanzhong had the wisdom to use circumstances and the nature of people to deal with the issue. He dealt with the issue peacefully, indirectly, and without the use of force. The eunuch and the deer. One of my favorite Chinese expressions is calling a deer a horse. It refers to people so powerful that they're able to distort the truth, and it comes from a story about the second emperor of the Qing dynasty, Emperor Qinashi, and his imperial chancellor Zhaogao. Zhaogao was a powerful eunuch of the royal court, and the emperor viewed him as his tutor. During a hunting trip with the emperor, Zhaogao presented the emperor with a large deer. Zhaogao pointed at the deer and claimed that it was a horse. The emperor laughed and asked him, "Chancellor, that's obviously a deer." "Are you mistaken?" "My emperor, this is not a deer. You might be the one who is mistaken. This is clearly a horse." The emperor looked puzzled. "Chancellor, that is clearly a deer, can you not see?" "If your majesty does not believe me, let us ask the ministers for their opinion." The other ministers knew that it was a deer, but they feared Zhaogao more than they feared the emperor. Looking sheepishly around, the ministers were forced to nod softly in agreement. This seemingly irrelevant event solidified Zhaogao's influence and power over the other ministers. It was a small, yet grand demonstration that served 3 purposes. First, it tested the allegiance of the other officials. Would they side with him, or would they side with the emperor? Second, it was to show the ministers how much influence he had over the court, so they could see that almost all the ministers were subject to his control. And finally, perhaps most importantly, it was to teach the emperor that he, Zhaogao, was the one true ruler of the dynasty. His power and influence surpassed the emperor's own. Circumstances can create anything, even a deer from a horse, if you have the wisdom to know how. Who has the strength to lift Qin wood? Shan Yang was a reformer serving the state of Qin, where his policies laid the political and economic foundations that would eventually enable Qin to conquer the other 6 rival states during the period. Before Shan Yang started his radical changes, the story goes he first tried to gain support and trust in the government by placing a large piece of wood at the eastern gate of the city. In front of that wood was a notice that said, if anyone can move this wood from the east to the west gate, they will be rewarded with 1,000 pieces of gold from the emperor. The eastern gate was an extremely busy area of the city, but almost everyone walked past the wood without bothering to stop. They walked past thinking, nobody is going to give me 1,000 gold pieces for doing this. The wood sat there untouched for 3 days. Finally, somebody decided to give it a try and moved it, quite easily, from the east to the west side of the city, all the time doubting that anything would actually happen. And when he arrived at the western gate, an official came out and rewarded him with the 1,000 gold pieces as promised. The story spread quickly, and it greatly enhanced the people's trust in the emperor and his ability to follow through with his promises. Later, when the emperor tried to push through the new reforms, he found it much easier. This story is now known as migrating wood to establish trust. Life is full of colors, shades, and everything in between. In quantum mechanics, there's a concept called superpositioning, where matter can exist in multiple states simultaneously. Never to be outdone, the Chinese also have their own philosophical version of this, a belief that things come into being because of different, often opposing, forces interacting with each other. But you probably know this better as the yin and yang. The yin and yang is a belief that the natural world is created by forces that might seem like opposites on the surface, but are actually interconnected underneath. Without light, there wouldn't be darkness, and without weakness, there wouldn't be strength. When the sun rises in the morning, it's constantly working against the effect of time. As it rises during the day, it's getting closer to its peak height in the sky. Not only won't it continue to rise forever, at some point it will begin to fall. Do you know how you know this? Sure, it's physics, but it's also because you understand that what happens around you isn't only driven by what you can see. In any situation, there's a number of different forces at work, even though you won't be able to see them all. We can see the hands of our watch moving, but we won't be able to see the gears creating the movement. It would obviously be wrong to think that the movement was generated by the hands of the clock just because it was the only part we could see. But how many of us fall into this kind of trap, believing that what we see is all there is? There's a joke about a hungry young child who leaves home to buy some bread. After eating a piece of bread, he finds that he is still hungry. He goes to another store for bread, but that one also fails to satisfy him. He goes to a third, a fourth, and eventually a fifth store before he's finally full. But at the fifth store, he feels remorseful. He thinks to himself, if I knew this was the store that would make me full, I wouldn't have wasted my time with the other four. Many events happen because of forces that we can't see, but we choose to attribute the cause to what is the most observable or what most readily comes to mind. We can't help it. It's availability bias in action. Unfortunately, life is also a canvas that's cluttered with shapes of different types and colors, constantly fighting for our attention, making it hard for us to distinguish between what is false and what is true. And we don't make it easy for ourselves. When our minds are not absorbed by distractions, we are daydreaming about yesterday or tomorrow. The solution? Widen our aperture. When I was a child, I visited art galleries that displayed some beautiful Chinese calligraphy art. The works demonstrated the artist's skill in using different styles of brushstrokes. Grass script, for example, is a style of writing that looks cursive and purposefully sloppy, whereas clerical script emphasizes characters that have delicate tips, which is impossible to replicate on stone inscriptions. And then there were pieces of art that just looked like blotches of ink on the page. They looked as if ink was poured onto the top of the page and allowed to drip down to the bottom. Was this supposed to be art? I could have done that. For the enlightened, though, what made these works of art special was not their ink trails, but the empty space that was left behind. When the artist draws all over the painting, completely filling the space, it's difficult to understand the message they're trying to communicate. When they leave enough space in the right way, however, they allow for a theme to emerge. It's easier to emphasize a spot on the page by leaving most of the page blank because the dot has a much larger impact that way. Timothy Versteinen, an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience at Carnegie Mellon University, says that as much as 90% of our perception is mental fabrication. It's more efficient for our minds to fill in the gaps because it takes too much energy to process every single trigger hitting our mental and bodily sensors. Our brain learns from experience and builds models to predict our future interactions with the environment. Is this to say that we're all delusional? Well, maybe not, but it does mean that we're getting a limited slice of what is happening in the world. Looking past what's capturing our immediate attention takes deliberate practice and thought because it's not something we tend to do naturally. The best chance we have of breaking out of our coma is to refocus our attention on what is happening in the moment. But where mindfulness teachers would instruct you to be aware of your thoughts and actions, Sun Tzu would instead tell you to pay attention to the forces surrounding what you see. Be aware of the invisible hand creating the movements that you see. I know it sounds a bit cryptic, but in practice it's really not, because he gives us a very basic instruction for doing this. learn to focus on the opposite of what you are seeing. For instance, when someone tells you, in their words, the truth, look for why it might be false. How many times have you heard someone say, "To be honest today"? We do this because we know that multiple, often opposing, forces are always at play. Remember the yin and the yang? We need to purposefully bring a contrary perspective to the thoughts and observations we gravitate toward in order to bring balance to our perspective. If we don't, we're going to miss out on seeing the broader picture because our brain has fixated on the black ink spot and chosen to ignore the rest. Absolutes don't exist. If you're ever fortunate enough to read Sun Tzu's original text, you'll begin to appreciate his uncanny ability to piece together separate ideas in ways that wonderfully reinforce one another. One point he comes back to time and time again is the idea that there are no absolutes in life. This means that even the strongest person will have a weakness, and the weakest will always have their strengths. There will be negatives hidden within every positive, and positives hiding within every negative. No situation, no matter how bad it may seem on the surface, is unsalvageable. No person will be a complete saint, irrespective of how much good they do. Life is in a state of constant flux. It's full of wonderful colors and an abundance of shades that blur all boundaries. Sun Tzu's reasoning was simple. If we can't always see the forces shaping our lives, and if we're always missing some piece of information due to life's uncertainties, then why should we hold too strongly onto our current views on how we think the world should be? A smarter and more constructive way to live is to try and keep ourselves open to new information and new ways of seeing how the situation is evolving. If we can do that, we won't be so prone to missing the opportunity to act. During the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, Japanese soldiers mounted a full-scale invasion of China that lasted almost 8 years. The Chinese government was not prepared for the invasion and was easily overrun. While being occupied, the Chinese leaders said, "We will learn to exchange time for preparation. What we have right now is free time. While the Japanese are preoccupied with their invasion, they won't be a match for us in terms of time to prepare." These leaders showed immense wisdom and foresight given the pressures they were facing. It was their ability to see beyond what was immediately in front of them, even when so close to ruin, that let the Chinese people persevere and in the end emerge victorious. It will take some time and experience to truly see and appreciate this, but once you do, this philosophy will become an invaluable source of strength, because you will then allow something even more sacred to emerge, the belief that there will always be a path to success. It's only a matter of working with your creativity and patience to find the right opportunity. And at that point, there's nothing life can throw at you that will upset your flow. Beware of the fortune tellers. In China, it's popular for people to have their fortune read from their palm or face. There's a lot of history behind these methods as they've been passed from generation to generation of students. But to be a successful fortune teller today, not only do you have to learn the craft, you also have to know some tricks of the trade. I once spoke to a fortune teller who shared a story about when his credibility was rudely put to the test. He said, one evening a group of 5 men walked up to his stall and said, "We want to test your skill as a fortune teller. Can you tell which one of us is the CEO based only on our faces?" These men obviously weren't there to have their fortune read. They were there for a fight and probably thought they could fool the fortune teller pretty easily. But the fortune teller had seen this before, so he decided to play along and asked them to sit. One key lesson that he had picked up over the years was to be courageous when making predictions but cautious when validating them. From the moment they sat down, the answer was immediately obvious. They were so accustomed to letting the CEO sit first that they instinctively waited for him to move before they followed. It was a small detail, but enough for the fortune teller to cast his hypothesis. The fortune teller said, the CEO must have a rather high nose." The men, of course, had no clue who had the higher nose, even though they spent every day talking to each other, so they tried to sneak a quick glance at the CEO's nose. The fortune teller didn't miss a beat. "Look at our CEO here." Even though his nose is not particularly high, it is well rounded and full. And he completed the act by making grand gestures in front of the men, who were clearly impressed and satisfied that he had passed their test. In Chinese fortune-telling, there is no significant relationship between the success of a person and their facial features, as these are two aspects that can change over time. The fortune-teller didn't want to displease the men in case they made a scene, so he used Sun Tzu's lessons to help him avoid confrontation. Find the right entry point. I've often wondered why my mind always seems to be actively working to bring me down. My fear is constantly yelling at me to stop, worry more, or retreat. Recently, I began to ask, what if I could choose to believe differently? Our fears tend to be unfounded and unconstructive anyway. Fearing failure is boring and ordinary. Most companies will fail. Most people will need to reset their careers midway through. Statistics will tell you this. Why let fear define you or the way you think? Over the past few years, I've been running an experiment where I try to actively ignore the thoughts that I have. When a thought comes, I nicely acknowledge that I've had the thought, and then I proceed to carry on doing what I was previously doing, listening to none of the advice it was trying to give me. This is harder than you think. That voice in your head is amazingly seductive. It tries to trick you by fooling you into believing that it's helping to analyze and plan for the future. It tries to trick you by going over the things you have to say in the meeting you're about to have, over and over and over. But I stuck with it, and after a few months I've realized that life is turning out just fine. The analytical thinking mind was blocking my more relaxed flow mind, the mind I needed to be in touch with in order to access my intuition and my ability to create. It turns out we don't need to be analytical in most situations. I can't say that I'm anywhere close to mastering turning off the thinking mind, but this little experiment has taught me that the perspective we choose to believe really is a choice. How you choose to respond to events is always within your control, and it has nothing to do with the events themselves. There's a joke about an American shoe company that sought to expand into a new market in the small country of Nepal. They decided to do some market research before they invested, so they sent over 2 consultants. The consultants conducted their research separately and after a while reported their results to headquarters. The first researcher said that the market in Nepal was very small because the locals often didn't wear shoes. But the second researcher reported that Nepal was a fantastic investment opportunity because the locals hadn't even started to wear shoes. Both were seeing the same data points, but came to radically different conclusions because of their different starting perspectives. Suppose there were a bunch of grapes on the table, and you decided to eat them according to the size of the grapes. You might start in descending order, eating the largest grape first before eating the next largest grape. Or you might start in ascending order, first eating the smallest grape and then eating a slightly larger one next. In reality, these experiences are the same. You are still eating a bunch of small grapes, but from your perspective, there's a world of difference. This difference in focus has completely changed how you choose to view the grapes. To Sun Tzu, the beauty of life came from having the wisdom to choose the right starting perspective. He called this finding the right entry point. All circumstances could be turned into opportunities if we spent the time to understand and reflect on how we were positioned in the situation. He believed that the victor of a battle was determined before any fighting had begun, because victory was determined by the mindset of the contesting leaders. Victory will be claimed by the leader who has the most appropriate assessment of the situation and the right perspective. So keep looking for that opportunity and start now. Don't wait for things to be perfect. A perfect moment will never come. Look for a way to begin that will give you maximum leverage with what you've currently got. Most of us won't have as much foresight as Sun Tzu. Most us, myself included, will only be able to recognize what's happening after it's hit us square on the nose. So don't worry too much about how the situation might seem to be working against you. Circumstances will change. Be prepared for the situation to change and expect it to change. Expect life to be different from when you first set out. It's never too late to act. We can continue to try and work with how events are unfolding. The most foolish thing we can do is to give up just because life doesn't seem to want to agree with us anymore, or we've already set off down a particular path that we want to keep treading. Keep toiling away, but trust your intuition and be open to unexpected events. The sleeping dragon. Occasionally, we do come across people who seem to always be 2 or 3 steps ahead of everyone else, like there was some enchantment at play that allowed them to see the ending of the story before it was written. Zhuge was one of those people. Zhuge, nicknamed the Sleeping Dragon, was a military strategist in the Three Kingdoms period who knew that the then unified China would eventually crumble into multiple competing states. In his Longzhong plan, he said a fracture of the nation was inevitable because China had been unified for so long. He wrote, "Anything that has been together for too long will eventually rupture." This is something that not only applies to China, but to everything in Earth's history. If the split of China was inevitable, why should he wait for it to happen? Why weren't they the ones to split it? History would prove Zhuge to be right. The existing Han dynasty collapsed, and Zhuge was prepared to take full advantage of the situation, propelling China into the Three Kingdoms period. Zhuge confidence came from his faith in nature, following a well-trodden path. Ancient Chinese horse racing. Did you know that horse racing was as popular in ancient China as it is today? Perhaps because of the role of horses in hunting and the military, horse racing was popular since the beginning of the Zhou dynasty in 1046 B.C. It was deemed one of the 6 noble arts, along with morality, ritual, dance, archery, mathematics, and calligraphy. And from the spring and autumn period comes a fairly famous story about the racing strategy of one particular noble. The story goes that Tianji loved gambling in races with his other noble friends. Unfortunately, Tianji's horses seemed to always be slightly inferior to his rivals. After one particularly devastating day, he returned home depressed because he'd lost all his gold. He complained, "What should I do? I've lost so many races that maybe I should give up." His friend replied, "Don't give up. I have an easy fix for you. Classify your horses into 3 categories, the best, the average, and the worst. Then do the same with the horses of your friends. Circle their best horses, their average horses, and their worst horses. The next time you race, match their best horse with your worst horse. It will lose, but that's part of the plan. Next, you should pair your average horse with their worst horse, and then your best horse with their average horse. Because of these pairings, you will win the next 2 rounds, and because it's a best-of-3 game, you will also win their gold." The next day, Tianji did as he was told, and he ended up winning back all the gold he had lost the day before. The missing piece of the puzzle is often not the resources we have at our disposal, but knowing how to deploy them in the most effective way. When running from a bear, you don't have to be the fastest. You only have to be faster than the person next to you. Just kidding.